Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this IANA webinar, Intermodal Analyzed with Larry Gross. Really pleased to have you here today and have our friend Larry back to talk intermodal. This is the second in the series. Plan to do several more throughout the year, so stay tuned. Just really quickly, I'd like to shout out to our platinum sponsors who are making this webinar possible, and they provide a lot of support for our educational programming and other projects throughout the year. So a nod to them. Thank you very much for the support and the continued acknowledgement of how important everybody in the supply chain is. I'm Hal Pollard. I'm the Director of Education here at IANA, and he probably doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Larry Gross is the President of Gross Transportation Consulting, the Intermodalist, a trusted voice and a good friend of IANA and the intermodal industry. Without further ado, I'm going to start us off with something new this time, a poll, just to kind of take the temperature of where people are and what they're thinking about what's happening. What you should be seeing is a poll. What's your estimate for the 2020 total intermodal volume versus 2019? At the end of the year, how do you think things are going to shake out? It's been a crazy year for certain, but we want to see the wisdom of the crowd. So your options are 5% or more deficit, 0 to 5% deficit. Things will remain flat. There'll be a 0 to 5% growth or more than 5% growth. So take a moment and fill out your selection, hit submit, and we'll give you guys a little bit of time, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at our results.
You know, Hal, this is really, I think, a useful exercise, because with the amount of uncertainty that we have out there, the wisdom of the crowds is really, I think, we have a broad cross-section of folks listening in here, and they're all seeing something a little bit different. So I'm very interested to see what the group thinks here.
You're spot on, Larry. We've got a great cross-section of folks, and they're living and breathing this every day. So it will be really interesting to see where they come back on this. So that's probably enough time. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at the results?
So I guess I would say, Hal, it looks like obviously folks are leaning towards the downside here, with 40% thinking that there's going to be an overall deficit of over 5% year over year, 68% thinking that it's going to be a down year, and only about 17% thinking that there's going to be any kind of growth in the picture, which would, I think, if we look at the numbers, imply a pretty strong second half if we're going to get back into the black for an overall number. Yeah. So that's what the crowd thinks. And so hopefully at this point, what you're seeing is my presentation. What I'm going to do is try and run through some slides that describe what the current situation is. And then again, like we did last time, we'll use the Intermodal Analyzer. I've modified it a little bit to make it a little more webinar friendly, and do a little bit of a deeper dive on what's happening. Here's my contact info. If you get questions that we don't have time to answer or want to reach out, you can get to me at lgross@intermodalinDepth.com, and I'm on Twitter using the handle Intermodalist. You know, one of the things that's most unprecedented about this current situation is the number of times we have to use the word unprecedented. It is just one surprise after another, and certainly one of those surprises took place in June with this tremendous leap that we saw in domestic intermodal volume based on the IANA ETSO data. And that's what's shown in this on the green line here. The blue line is the international, the IPI volumes, and then the red line is the composite, which is the total, the red line working off of the left-hand axis, the blue and green lines working off of the right-hand axis. And you see this tremendous disconnect that's taking place right now between international and domestic. I mean, they don't always move in lockstep, but generally speaking, they're moving in something resembling a parallel world. Certainly that has not been the case so far during this, certainly through the second quarter. We saw the international side rebound from the very weak performance that it had in March and April, as volume started moving from China, as China reawoke from its pandemic lockdown. But since then, volume has been sliding. We had a horrific April in terms of of domestic, but wow, look at that rebound. It has been really, really remarkable. So let's dig into this a little bit. And what I'm showing you here is the pattern on the left, the year-over-year change by month, going back over the last 12 months. Again, same pattern. Blue is international or IPI, ISO containers. Green is domestic equipment, including TUFC and domestic container. And red is the overall intermodal number. And on the right, you can see what the change was for June, both from prior month and year over year. And when you look at year over year numbers, well, the first thing I want to point out here is that there is in this particular month of June 2020, there was a fairly significant calendar effect, or you might call it a working day effect, that took place both with regard to the month-to-month move and year-to-year. We have 3% more working days in June than we did in May. And this year, June 2020 had 4% more working days than June 2019. So what that has the effect of is it gooses the month-to-month increase by about 3%, and it increases the year-over-year gains by about 4%. So you can, if you really want to see an apples to apples, you can knock those numbers off of the numbers that I'm showing you here. The other thing that we always have to be cognizant of, particularly with the year-over-year numbers, is what are we comparing to? And so to refresh my memory as I was preparing for this webinar, I went back and looked at the Intermodal in-depth report for last year, for last July, last June, and it refreshed my memory that last June was the very trough of domestic performance. It was a weak month. It was the weakest month of the year in terms of overall volume, with the exception of February, which is always a short and a quiet month. And June of 2019, domestic volume was down 10% versus prior year. That was the biggest deficit of the year. So when we look at these year-over-year growth numbers, we just have to keep that in mind. That's not to say that there isn't a good story here. There is, but it may not be quite as good as we're looking at right now. If we jump into this, we can see that international continued to decline from prior month, over 2% decline, and the year-over-year is still a pretty severe deficit in excess of 15%. We turn to the domestic equipment, the story is completely different. First of all, we look at the trailer numbers, and the month-over-month gains in the trailer were even larger on a percentage basis than they were for domestic container, over 17% year-over-year growth. And even the short trailers, which are the 48s, the 45s, and most importantly, the 28s, showed a sizable increase, which is evidence of the e-commerce slant of the volume that's moving right now in domestic. And you can see on a year-over-year basis, they moved into the black, which was quite an achievement given the size of the deficit that was taking place. On the domestic container side, a little bit slower growth from the prior month, just a tad, just under 17%. Of particular note is the huge jump in rail-owned domestic container of over 30%. We talked about that sector in some depth during our last visit together last month. And what you're seeing here, I think more than anything else, is the snapback or the comeback of the Mexico auto assembly plants and having to refill that pipeline with automotive components, which rail-owned domestic container is a big chunk of that piece. So we were expecting to see a jump. I don't know that I was expecting to see 30%. And these numbers are very, very impressive, even considering all of the caveats I gave you, to even be in the black at all, much less by significant amounts year over year, is quite an amazing achievement. Now, on the import side, that's what's ultimately going to drive at least the IPI piece of the puzzle for intermodal, as well as the transload piece, which is at least 15% of what's happening in domestic. And the picture here is still relatively weak based on at least the June numbers, which is the most recent that we have available. We were down somewhere in the high single digits in terms of a deficit. The way to read this chart is the yellow line is loaded export TEUs coming out of the North America. The blue line is loaded import TEUs, both of those working off of the right-hand axis. and the red line is total TEUs, and those are working off of the left-hand axis. So we're still seeing, we saw a trough here in March, a decent rebound in April, and since then, volume really hasn't gone very far, still down at about the same range. So if there's a snapback occurring, we're not seeing it here. The other thing I'll point out is this big drop that took place as the lockdowns took hold, the drop in exports, and we've not seen any sign of acceleration there. In fact, the year-over-year deficit has deepened, and now we're closing in on a 20% year-over-year deficit. So the situation on the export side looks pretty grim right at the moment based on the latest data. If we look at it on a seasonally adjusted basis, normally we would be expecting volume to start to increase this year. Just give you an idea of what our normal peak for imports is in August, and we should be starting to see some acceleration, but as you can see, once we've applied these seasonal adjustments to it, we're really not going anywhere at all. In fact, on a seasonally adjusted basis, because volume is normally higher in May, once we apply those adjustments, actually May was weaker than March was. And the way to read this chart is the blue is the seasonally adjusted numbers, the yellow bars are the month-to-month changes. Once we look at the total, there is a change that's occurring of great intermodal significance within the totals, and that is that as we have started to come back out of the depths of the downturn, we are seeing a shift back from the East Coast to the West Coast for import volume. And it's been quite striking, as you can see on this chart on the right-hand side. We got down pretty far in terms of West Coast, U.S. West Coast share, just a little over 36% at the depth here in March. But since then, it has rebounded sharply, and actually in June was just south of 44%. So that's actually above the 12-month average, which is this yellow line here, and just about even with prior year. And that is a much more intermodal friendly situation than when the volume was coming into the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And it may help to explain some of the tightness that we're hearing about anecdotally, particularly in LA Long Beach, and I'll be trying to peel that onion a little bit as we go through the rest of the presentation. One item that I track is to try and see what the intermodal participation rate is versus imports. And that's what you see here on the left-hand side. This is the number of TEUs moving intermodally versus the number of TEUs that are coming in to the North American ports. And as you can see, that red line, which is the month-to-month, this ratio bounces around a heck of a lot based on sort of variability and ship timing and whatnot. So I like to look at that yellow line, which is the 6-month moving average, and that shows you what the overall underlying trend is. And as you can see here in the last few months, the 2020, so far in 2020, it looks like that ratio is kind of stabilized, which is good news because you can see the general trend has been downward. And there's a fairly decent seasonal aspect to this number as well. If we add the Southern California transloads into it, the picture is a little bit different. We still see that downward trend, and we haven't yet seen that sign of stabilization. Still looks like it's going down, but there's an awful lot of variability here. I would say that the situation is looking a little bit better than it had been, and perhaps we're seeing some signs of stabilization, but we're going to want to see that as well with the transloads added in order for me to really feel comfortable saying that. Just a quick look at the service situation. When we spoke together last month, the services in terms of at least average train speed, which is the only thing we have to look at, were at extremely high levels. And since then, we've seen quite a decline. If you look at that red line, speeds have come down fairly significantly, but they were so high that they're still in a relatively good position, certainly higher than the average of the last 5 years, which is that light blue line that you can see. We're still about 6% better than the 5-year average overall, although there is a fair amount of variability with that, and some of the railroads are not quite as robust in terms of their performance as others. but all of them still are in, I think, in a pretty good place. We're not seeing anybody that's showing signs of distress yet. Now, here we are now 3 weeks, and the data will be coming out tomorrow for the 4th week in July. So the AAR numbers give us a glimpse of what's going on. They don't allow us to parse the data like we do with the IANA, but at least we can see what the top line number is. And the top line number looks like it's still very, very strong. So it sort of coincides with the anecdotes that we're hearing, particularly on the domestic side. You look at this big jump this is the weekly numbers for North America, this big jump. We saw a decline here, which was July 4th holiday week. It came back a little bit the next week, and then there was a big, big jump the week following. And so the latest deficit of just 1.7% is very modest. And it looks like, as of yet, the snapback or this V-shaped recovery that we seem to be experiencing doesn't yet look like it's running out of steam. Very, very impressive. One of the things that we've seen so far during 2020 is that there has been a divergence in the performance, particularly between the US and Canada. And this is based on those AAR numbers. And what we're doing here is we're comparing the 3 USMCA or NAFTA nations, US in blue, Canada in red, Mexico in yellow. And we're comparing each week's performance with the week, with the average week in 2018 equals 100. And what you can see here is that for most of 2012, or at least most of the second quarter, Canada was performing much more strongly relative to where it had been than the US was. And Mexico, it was an even more extreme decline from a very strong performance early in 2020 down to a very weak performance here about the beginning of the second quarter. But the news seems to be that there's a bit of a convergence that's occurred lately, and everybody seems to be returning to some semblance of what previously was normal. So that realignment seems to be underway right now. Now, in terms of what the outlook is, well, obviously, since I completely missed the very strong domestic rebound that we saw in June, I don't claim to have any particular vision looking forward here. But, I'll just list a few of the things that I'm watching. And, on the pro side, well, you can't argue with the facts. And the facts are that freight volumes are very strong, not only for intermodal, but seemingly based on truck spot market performance. The trucking side is strong as well. Where we're not seeing it yet, although it may be occurring here in July, is we're not seeing it on the import side. Now, the government has been very generous in its support to try and keep the effects of the pandemic lockdown at bay, and I think they've been quite successful at that, as evidenced by the freight numbers. And the other thing that seems to be happening is that folks have this money to spend, but they don't have services to spend it on. They're not spending it on eating out. They're not spending it on movies, on sports events, on theater, on concerts. So what do they have to spend it on? Well, they can spend it on stuff. And certainly stuff, they're locked in at home. They're aware of the shortcomings of their work situation at home. And maybe that's going to be a long-term situation. So they're going to try and make their home a little bit more comfortable. And as a result of that, I would say that there's some preliminary evidence that the freight content of GDP has shifted more in favor of freight, and certainly that's what we like to see. When you're buying stuff, whether it's renovation materials, paint, washing machines, bicycles, all sorts of things that seem to be in demand right now, that's going to translate into freight. So that's a good news from an intermodal perspective. On the negative side, I think the list, from my perspective, is fairly significant. Of course, one is just what's happening with the virus, which underpins all of this. We have right now, we're right on the cusp of expiration of the current levels of support. The $600 a week unemployment benefit expires either at the end of last week or for some states at the end of this week. And there was just a bill put out by the GOP, proposed bill late last night, with the distance between that bill and the Democrats it's certain that I think that there's going to be at least a lapse in this support before some kind of a compromise is reached. It's going to be a fairly extensive dialogue, and so there's going to be an interruption. And what is the effect of that going to be? We're certainly going to see some additional unemployment. We're already seeing it in the numbers. There's a potential foreclosure wave and small business bankruptcy wave looming. Reopening efforts are being slowed in certain states, or paused in certain states, even potentially rolled back. And societal fears are still very, very high. I mean, it doesn't make any difference if my governor says you can go back to the stores. If I'm afraid to go into a store, if I'm afraid to go into a restaurant, I may not be able to do it or decide to do it. And as a result, I think the net effects of how quickly we're going to come back is going to be restricted by the accelerating virus. And then, of course, we have the front and center issue right now of back to school, which is certainly a topic of great controversy. And from an economic perspective, if you're not going to actually go back into a school environment, then a lot of the purchases that you would normally make, you're not going to be making. So the back to school season from a retail perspective perhaps is going to be quite disappointing. So for me, being the curmudgeon that I am, the balance appears negative. But as I mentioned before, I didn't see the June V-shaped rebound that occurred. So the phrase, I think, for the audience is caveat emptor, buyer beware. The one thing I can say is that we should all maintain a great deal of flexibility. This isn't the time, I don't think, to be making big bets on what this recovery is going to look like, because there's just still too much uncertainty out there. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into what's going on with this domestic surge. And one of the things I mentioned was this disconnect. And let's look at a couple of key lanes off of the West Coast. One is on the left-hand side is Midwest, Southwest. Again, 2018 average is 100. So you can see that the yellow line here is the imports that were coming in month by month into the port of LA Long Beach. The blue line is the number IPI volumes in terms of revenue moves coming out of the Southwest region, which is California. And the green line is the amount of domestic equipment, 2FC and domestic containers coming out. And there was firstly a major disconnect in March when both the import TUs and the IPI numbers tanked. And then what you see here is a real divergence, a very unusual divergence here in May and even more so in June, with this tremendous surge in domestic volume, while there was a much smaller increase in TUs arriving and IPI actually going down. There is not a lot that is being manufactured in California these days, and the volume coming out is basically transload volume. So my conclusion here is that what has driven some of this tremendous surge in June has to be inventory that had previously arrived and had been warehoused on the West Coast near the ports, awaiting some clarity on what was going to transpire with the domestic consumption situation. And that volume started to move in earnest in June. I just don't see an explanation other than that. And certainly there is, we know, a very high e-commerce component to this story. If we look on the right-hand side, this is another major West Coast market. This is Midwest, Northwest, so PNW. And the story is somewhat the same here, but we have much less of a transload component in the Northwest and the PNW than we do in SoCal, Southern Cal. We're still seeing that disconnect. This is the domestic number, this is the IPI number on blue, and then here are the inbound TEUs, and the ports of Tacoma and Seattle have been very, very hard hit in terms of their import numbers. So there is still a disconnect, but it doesn't have that huge domestic component that we do see out of the Southwest region. One way that we can see what's happening in LA Long Beach is by looking at the drayage demand index, which I get the numbers, the click numbers from my friend Jason Hilsenbeck of drayage.com. and we do that for 21 individual markets. This is the LA Long Beach market, and it shows, I'd say, a somewhat elevated number, but nothing completely out of the ordinary with regard to previous experience. So it looks to me like there has been something of an acceleration in terms of activity in the Los Angeles, Long Beach area, but nothing that would, I'd say, indicate that the market is absolutely on fire. So some of, I think, the congestion and the anecdotes that we're seeing here has just been that the rebound has taken folks a little bit by surprise. Equipment's been out of position. There's been a heavy e-commerce aspect to it, and all of these factors are coming in together. Jason, I chatted with him this morning. He had an interesting comment. Why are we seeing this trend back towards the West Coast, and in particular back towards LA Long Beach? And one of the things that he mentioned is that we are seeing, I think, a premium on being reactive and trying to get freight, once we have some idea of what's happening, trying to get freight into position as rapidly as possible. So that may be one reason why folks are favoring a West Coast option right now, because once they decide to make a move and bring inventory in from overseas, typically the West Coast option is going to be the fastest to market. So maybe we're seeing that benefit a little bit here. Just to give you an idea of the normal seasonality in LA Long Beach, the normal trough is in March. Volume increases 18% in April, another 9% in May, retrenches just a bit in June, about a point, then another 3.5% up in July, and it peaks in August with another 3%. So obviously there's not been anything like that this year. We saw a big jump in April, about flat in May, a little bit of an uptick in June. It's not following a normal seasonal pattern, is, I guess, the message that I would give you there. So with that, let me switch over to the volume analyzer. And what I've done is I've rigged it up with some charts. It's driving some charts that you see here. And this is going to make it a little easier, I think, for the audience to see what it's trying to tell us, rather than trying to fish out of a sea of numbers. So the way to read this is on the left-hand side, you can see the actual volume as reported by the IANA ETSO database. That's that blue line, and playing off of the right-hand axis, thousands of moves per month. The red bars are the month-to-month change. So you can see that the volume fell. This is what we've got going here is all total intermodal. And you can see on this left-hand chart, volume was 6% higher in January than it was in December, dropped 12% in February, dropped another 4% in March before the rebound started, and volume increased 4%, then another 5%, then another 5%. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, you see these vertical bars, blue bars. This is the year-over-year deficit by month or increase. On the left-hand side, the dark blue is the monthly numbers. Then you see in the lighter blue the quarterly numbers, and we have now full numbers for the second quarter. And the lightest blue all the way at the right is year-to-date. So June was down only about 2%, a little less year-over-year for total intermodal. Q1 was down 8%, Q2 down 7%. You could see our overall year-to-date number deficit is 8%. Let's now take a little bit of a deeper dive. First, let's look at what's happened internationally. And you can see there was this tremendous jump in April. We talked about that, a 24% month-to-month rise. But since then, volume has been sliding. Down 2% in May, an additional 5% in June, and that's resulted in an overall international or IPI deficit of 20% year over year. Picture is completely different on the domestic side. Domestic, we saw the trough in April as the lockdowns were in their full force. This has been followed by a very rapid recovery, 11% gain in May, another 12% in June, so actually even a little bit of an acceleration. And the June numbers hang on, I'm sorry, I was giving you, those were numbers I was giving you were just for Midwest, Southwest. I beg your pardon. Let's go back just quickly here to the domestic. This is the total numbers. This gives you a little bit of a picture. The story is roughly the same. It wasn't for international though. So on the international side, this is now total. 19% drop in February, 2% in March, an increase in April, and since then 2% declines in May and June. Overall number 15% down, and year to date 13% decline. So still I would say a very rough picture here, and no sign in, at least as far as June, of any kind of significant acceleration. On the domestic side, quite the different picture. And here, yes, 6% rise in June year over year, with this incredible turnaround in the deficit. If we drill down a little further, look at the trailer piece. The trailer piece, the rebound was even stronger, a very, very strong gain month to month in May, 22%, followed by another 17% gain in June, and that was enough to go from a huge 31% year over year deficit in April to a 5% gain year over year in June. And if we look at the two main equipment types, the 28 footers, which are favored by parcel carriers and by LTL carriers, a pretty decent gain. We're back to flat in June versus a 26% deficit as recently as March. The 53-foot gains have been even stronger. And I think this is an example either of one of two things happening. I think most likely it's e-commerce effects, and to a lesser extent, especially in June as domestic container availability, and in July as domestic container availability in the West Coast was strained, we will start to see, I think, some QFC increases as a safety valve. On the container side, again, a very impressive rebound, 17% going to 7, and then 17% gain here, minus 17 to plus 17, and year over year deficit, 15% deficit transforming into a 7% gain. And if we divide this further into the private fleet, we can see some very impressive gains here. But if we look at the rail side, there's that 30% tremendous surge as volume came back, transforming a 25% deficit into an 8% increase. And what's interesting is if you look at the month-to-month changes, much more significant for the rail side than the private side. So let me zero all this out. I'll take another very few minutes here to look at a couple of lanes, and that's what I was doing before we went on. And I had the Midwest Southwest lane, which is the largest, most significant lane. This is Chicago, LA, basically, or Midwest to California. And you can see that the overall volume here, the gains compared to total are not quite the same. Year to date total here is 8% down, 2% gain in June. Total was 5%, so this is a bit stronger. But what is striking about this is just how different the international SIC picture is. Still 20% down, IPI volume moving between California and the Midwest versus domestic, 13% increase year over year. So, this kind of disconnect, I don't think can endure. And there are two ways it gets solved. Either IPI comes up or domestic comes down in order to get some sort of a semblance of a realignment. Or so obviously some mix of the two. I just don't know which way it's going to go right now. I suspect, based on the AAR numbers, that perhaps the situation is that the IPI numbers are starting to come up a bit. But I would just tell you, I don't think this current situation can endure. With that, I mean, I was hoping to be able to run through some additional lanes, but I see the time is getting long, so I think I'll wind it up here. I would just tell you, just if you looked at the top 5 lanes, that's roughly 50%, 53% to be exact, of all intermodal volume. Number 2 lane is Northeast Midwest. Number 3 lane is South Central Southwest. That's Texas, California. The number 4 lane is Eastern Canada, Western Canada, the Canadian Transcon. And interestingly, the number 5 lane, in terms of overall revenue moves, is intra-southeast. The top 10 lanes in general account for 74% of all intermodal volume. So intermodal is still quite concentrated on key lanes. Most of the other lanes, the other 45 lanes account for less than 25% of the overall volume. So with that, I'll remind you that we've got a special deal going with regard to the data bundle between both the IANA volume analyzer and my Intermodal in-depth. And if you subscribe to both, you get a 20% discount. So with that, Hal, I guess I'll turn it back over to you for Q&A, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Larry. That was great. Really, again, just interesting stuff. And I love the way that the analyzer allows us to dig into. Let's go ahead and jump into some of the questions. Here's one. What did precision railroading, rail decisions seem to have to do to relate to the effects of the improved numbers? Do you see any correlation there or any?
I think that where the effects so far of precision scheduled railroading have been is the route network simplifications and the increased selectivity of the railroads with regard to the intermodal market. So we have seen an overall decline in 2019. We were starting to see perhaps the first signs of stabilization in early 2020, and then the pandemic came along and kicked everything in the head. So it certainly has set back, I would say, the stabilization that we were hoping to see. The PSR story is theoretically a 2-chapter story. They've gone through chapter 1, which is sort of streamlining the network, getting things in order, and supposedly setting the table for growth. It's very hard to see that, obviously, when you're going through a pandemic. Where we would hope to see PSR effects is in their ability to deal with sudden changes in the environment, changes in volume. So I'll be watching to see whether, how well the industry is coping with this big surge that we're seeing here. PSR should position us better, and that may ultimately give us an opportunity to participate without, let's say, having the service issues that sometimes seem to accompany a rebound in volume. So I'm hopeful.
Good. No, that makes sense. Yeah, and it is. It's really difficult to say. It's not like there's a level playing field of year to year for the last 5 years with the evolution of PSR, trade war, Chinese New Year, COVID. It's kind of
one thing after another.
The lost year. So here's one. What's going on with exports? ? Do we think that the exports being down is still trade war related? Any thoughts on why exports are so anemic?
Well, I guess my initial impression, not backed by, I'll say, quality analysis, is that it's probably pandemic related, because it seemed so coincident with that big drop took place in April when everything locked down, and we just haven't seen much of a recovery. Now, what I would want to look at, and actually probably will here when I get some time, is looking at it by individual export market. So, if it's trade war related, then I would expect to see that China is down, exports to China are down more than elsewhere. I just haven't had a chance to look at that, so I don't have an opinion on that. It will be certainly a relief to see some signs of life coming out on the export side. The data tends to run about a month later, so we're only really now. I was showing you May data. I don't know yet. Haven't gotten the June numbers. Hopefully, we'll start to see, like we did on the international side, start to see a little bit of improvement.
Okay. This is sort of related to that, I guess, in a way. Any insights into how long domestic inventory can hold out, assuming that it's really domestic inventory that's feeding that domestic intermodal movement, since imports seem to be down?
I don't think it can hang on very long. There's not months and months of inventory stored on the West Coast. And I don't have data on this, so this is strictly an opinion, I guess. It's hard for me to imagine you could have more than a month or two's worth of inventory for the entire area that's serviced by the transload centers of the Southern California, that you could have more than a couple of months at most before things have got to realign in one form or another.
Yeah. That's one of the pieces that I know Peter Wolf at TTX will probably be looking into, and we'll probably be able to check back when we hear from those folks on August 25th. We'll be doing an Inside the Numbers Q2 review. A couple other ones here. Can you measure the impact that the reduction in 40-foot equipment inland has increased the demand for domestic containers? Is some of the domestic increase related to the shortage of 40s?
Well, what I did do was to look at the balance in domestic equipment flows east-west between the Midwest and the Southwest. Our theory was that maybe we were seeing a real imbalance with more volume moving eastbound than westbound. And I didn't see that in the numbers. You wouldn't necessarily see it in the 53-foot privates, because even if that piece of equipment is moving empty, it still has revenue associated with it to the railroad, and therefore would show up in the IANA numbers. Right. But where you would see it is in the rail owned domestic containers, because if one of those moves empty, there's no revenue associated with it, and so it doesn't show up. So I was looking for and really expected to see some imbalance there, but in fact there was absolutely no imbalance. In fact, somewhere here I jotted down the numbers. In June, the number of rail domestic containers was 10,400, and the number of eastbound was 10,300. You don't get more balance than that.
That's amazing.
It's not a direct answer to the question. I did not look at the imbalance on the IPI side. I guess it's possible. I think that what's happening right now is that the tremendous demand for eastbound volume is being throttled by the availability of westbound units and empty capacity being made available. There's certainly a lot of anecdotes out there of folks wanting to get capacity in California, out on the West Coast, and not having access to enough empties. So, that is, I think, the governor is the ability to move capacity into the area where right now there seems to be a very high demand.
Got it. All right, here's one. As a non-scientific sample, I am of one. I'm all in for mail order and home delivery. I'm sure that millions of others feel the same, regardless of the pandemic. What do you think is the long-term impact of basically the explosion of internet shopping? And what's the long-term effect on trailers versus containers and the business in general?
Well, I mean, those are two separate questions. I think in general, we talked a little bit about this last month. The rise of e-commerce is going to have an impact on intermodal. We know that e-commerce is about moving inventory closer to where the point of consumption is, because we want it tomorrow. We want it even today. So that says that inventory has got to be deployed forward, closer to the point of consumption, closer to the consumer, which doesn't exactly play to intermodal's strong suit, because it means that the inventory is going to be more dispersed as our population is dispersed. Having said that, there's certainly still a significant role for intermodal, because you're going to have inventory moving in the initial stages of that supply chain before it gets dispersed. Intermodal can still play a significant role in that. And I think in general, you're going to see, because of the service demands of e-commerce, that there's going to be a more of a premium on reliability and perhaps even ultimately speed, because this market demands both. The other piece of the puzzle is that it certainly will elevate the role of the parcel carriers, folks like UPS and FedEx, to the extent that you don't have a lot of e-commerce players don't have the extensive network that, let's say, an Amazon or a Walmart might have. And so then you're seeing lots of parcel movements from just a few locations going all over the country. And that, I think you can see that in the trailer numbers that we saw in June, a big spike in trailer usage, because there's only a limited amount of domestic container participation by those parcel carriers. It's moving in that direction. The future of the trailer, I'd say, is much more in the railroad's hands than it is in the market's hands. You're not seeing an increase in trailer usage in Canada or in Mexico because it's simply not available. And What I don't know is how long the railroads, especially under a PSR regimen, are going to be willing to continue to have a dual system of both TOFC and COFC, because that's a little bit of the sand in the gears, operationally speaking. So, that's a question that I guess gets posed to the various in the various boardrooms of the railroads, more so than to me.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, speaking of rail operational questions, here's one. It looks like there's a trend, at least numbers would seem to indicate that there might be a trend for on-dock rail volumes to drop while cross-dock volumes would be on the increase.
Yeah, if we look at the volume that's coming out of Southern California, there has definitely been a trend towards transloading. Transloading has had a larger share of the outbound intermodal volume than IPI. Now, I think a big chunk of that is that as we saw this west to east shift that has occurred prior to the most recent few months, that IPI volume is a lot less, I'll use the term sticky, than the transload volume. It's much easier for an importer to turn the dials, twiddle the dials, and reroute IPI volume to, let's say, a Savannah or a Prince Rupert, or than it is to construct an entirely new transload operation in one of these other locations. So that volume has been sort of more stable and stickier. And that's why that's a big chunk of why I think its share out of Southern California has increased.
Yeah, no, that makes loads of sense. Unfortunately, like you keep going, because I think, it's certainly, we are living in interesting times. Larry, thank you so much for the insights. As always, great conversation. And we are pleased to partner with Larry to bring you Intermodal In-Depth and the Volume Analyzers package deal. So if you'd like more information about that opportunity or the tools, take a look at the Volume Analyzer, kick the tires on that. Or the ETSO database, which is the full database set that Larry referenced that we pull the numbers from. For the analyzer, you can go over to intermodal.org and go to data and statistics, and that will you'll see all the information you need there. You can also just shoot me an email, hal@intermodal.org, or send an email to info@intermodal.org. Again, a shout out to our platinum sponsors for bringing this webinar to us today. They go above and beyond to help out us and the industry, and we really appreciate their support. And with that, I will say thank you, Larry, for all your work. Great to be able to spend time with you. All the attendees, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. I know your time is precious, and we really appreciate you spending some of it with us.